hopefully that theme song came through in the audio. Hope it sounds okay. We're always doing little tweaking here and there. That's the word they use these days, right? Tweaking to make sure the sound is okay. And you are with Journey of an Aesthete podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Hampton, and that is, of course, the theme song to the podcast, which I do live sometimes. And that's not the podcast, but actually theme song to book lunch. And so this book lunch, as I've advertised, as promised, is going to be a many episode series. I would say probably, if I had to guess the amount, I think we're going to do 7 episodes, perhaps, somewhere in that vicinity. At the very least 6. All devoted to John Updike and his Rabbit series of novels. Today, I'm going to go over to my chair and we're going to get relaxed. And I'm going to do a little show and tell today because we're introducing John Updike. And John Updike, I want to say a few general words about Updike the man. So Updike was one of the greatest fiction authors in the 20th century. He had a many decade career, many decades. He is a creature of the 1930s because that's when he was born, and his career went all the way into the 2000s. I think he passes in 2009 from lung cancer. He was a lifelong smoker. He hails from Shillington, Pennsylvania, and a lot of the content of these novels deal with the culture of Pennsylvania and related areas. Although he lived most of his life near Boston, he was a neighbor to me for like 30 years, and I think he lived in I forget the name, Ipswich, I think, in Massachusetts. And John Updike, the reason why the superlatives and the praise is because he essentially created a unique prose style in which he tries to carry as far as possible as an author can carry, the merging of internal life, with the English language. And he even says in this documentary we're going to see in a few minutes, he tries to go as far as he can with describing a scene or event or a character's opinions and feelings in a way to go outside. In other words, to almost disrupt, retard, complicate, problematize events and narratives. So he will describe a scene, he will describe somebody doing something, say a love scene between a man and a woman, and you're not even initially sure it is a love scene. Or for example, in Rabbit Run, well, there's a lot of things. In Rabbit Run, we open the novel with a basketball, kids playing basketball and this kind of thing. But he's very ornate in his prose, and he does this for 2 reasons. There's probably many more than 2, but the 2 that come to mind is that he loves the English language, he loves syntax, and he wants to create an art form out of prose because he's working in a high art tradition of literature, not a popular, he's not Stephen King, he's not Tom Clancy. He is his one of his best friends was Joyce Carol Oates, so he's a little bit like Joyce Carol Oates. And so the thing with Updike is the description, the prose, but the other thing is his absolute fidelity to recording what was happening in America sociologically. So there's a very realist naturalist reportorial journalistic dimension to his prose. So it's very unusual to have the combination. Usually writers are biased in favor of one or the other. They're a journalistic type of writer and they want to capture how it was, or they're artistic, they're interested in interior life. He loves prose, so he's bringing both these together. and doing it in a unique way. So when did I first encounter John Updike? Well, it would have been in the 70s, and actually I have a story about that. Give me a second here. At this bookstore, Books and Company. Books and Company in New York City. That's Jeanette Watson of the Watson family, IBM. And so I would go to this bookstore as a boy when I was in New York with my parents and just look and see what books were around. And so to give you a sense of the milieu into which I was partly ensconced, here's some of the people. There's Sontag, there's Salman Rushdie, there's her with some of her writers here. There's Fran Lebowitz in the late 70s, in the button-down white shirt that she always wore, and some other authors, Brendan Gill. So this was the milieu of high literary arts and letters. And I've always been interested in many things. I've always been a cinephile. I've always loved the screen as much as the stage, as much as the written word. But in this book lunch, we're going to delve into Updike and the written word. So I had read Pigeon Feathers, which is a collection of stories, and I wanted to buy a new Updike book because I really loved this author as a 8-year-old. I also had a crush on Jeanette Watson. That's another story. We'll get to that in a second. But I actually have the book I got still from Updike. And this is my 70s edition of Museums and Women. Look at that cover. Museums and One Another Stories. So I mentioned short stories. Well, initially Updike was a short story guy, you might say, more than a novelist. And, he's born in the 30s, he grows up, 40s, 50s, but here's the interesting thing. He goes to Harvard, and he also goes to Oxford. So he had an early love of Walt Disney and illustration and cartoons, and he also had a little bit of career as a portrait illustrator. And he went to Oxford for that, for a year, sometime, I guess, in the 50s, as well as attending Harvard. He lived in a famous dorm room because his roommate was Christopher Lasch, the great social critic and ex-Marxist sort of cultural commentator who wrote The Culture of Narcissism and who also influenced Jimmy Carter's Crisis of Confidence speech. In fact, James Fallows, who I know, who partly wrote Jimmy Carter's speech, had been reading Christopher Lasch and hanging out with him. Anyhow, Christopher Lasch was John Updike's roommate at Harvard. And John Updike wrote a short story called The Christian Roommates, a kind of interesting story about these contrasting roommates at Harvard. So I got this book, Museums and Women, and Jeanette Watson did not like Updike. She preferred, the authors that are in here, she preferred any of these. Brendan Gill, I'm sure, and she preferred, this is a better photograph of her in front of her bookstore. No, she didn't like Updike very much. I think she preferred Ann Beatty or Ann Tyler, I think. Roy Blount Jr., Albert Murray, the great Albert Murray, who unfortunately never got a chance to meet Albert Murray. He was friends of my friend Charlie Davidson. That's a jazz music connection. Anyhow, not to get too far. So, and she was curious, why does this little boy like this Updike? She says, do you like Museums and Women? I said, yeah, of course I like Museums and Women, I guess so, She wanted me to read different things. Now, I think on an earlier episode, I talked about the writers she hit me to. I think Ann Beatty was one of them. So she was getting me, in the 70s, this kind of interesting thing. So let's move ahead a little bit in time. We're going to go back to Harvard, but 1989 Harvard. So I graduated from New York Conservatory of Music, and this summer I took 3 classes at Harvard. I took a fiction writing class in 1989, and I actually took a fiction class where we would read great works by great writers. And my instructor at that time, she had us read two stories. One was Tell Me a Riddle by Tilly Olson, which was made into a wonderful movie with Lee Grant. I think it was directed by Lee Grant, I don't know, in the 70s, about the Jewish diaspora and immigrants' experience, and that's Tilly Olson. But the other text she picked was one of my favorite stories of Updike, Wife Wooing. Now, there are two famous stories that they always anthologize. Whenever kids have to read Updike in school, they always either give you A and P, or they give you Wife Wooing. Those are the stories. So I'm going to read some of Wife Wooing in a second, because I want to introduce his prose through this story that's totally unconnected with the Rabbit series, because I want to proceed kind of in a linear fashion, in a chronological fashion. Let me check my notes here. Christian roommates, wife wooing. Anyhow, one of the things my instructor, I forget her name, I think her name was Marjorie, but it was not Marjorie Garber. I wish it had been Marjorie Garber, who wrote Vested Interests and about trans matters and gender, and she's a Shakespeare scholar. Marjorie Garber wrote the book Shakespeare After All, which I highly recommend. You can put that in the... Anyhow, I think she was teaching somewhere in that vicinity, and it was not her, but it was a teaching assistant to Marjorie Garber. And we read Wife Wooing, and this is the late 80s, this is 89, and people were already, especially the female classmates, were already startled by or affected by the relentless honesty of Updike's depiction of inner male heterosexual life at that time. And that really, wife wooing, there's no, I mean, the very title will tell you, this is a point of view of this husband. And the instructor said, I suspect this character in Wife Wooing is a lot like Updike himself. That's what she said. I remember that. She loved the story. Jeanette Watson did not like Updike. So that gets to us kind of an issue that we're going to be confronting in this series. You can make art out of anything, practically. And that, by which I mean out of any topic or any subject. If you're a John Updike and you're trying to capture America in a general sense, and you're trying to capture, I guess, in part, not totally, but in part, male psychology and all of its dysfunction and pathologies and so on, as a writer, he has to confront that and deal with that. And he does it in these novels because the main character is a male, Harry Angstrom, Rabbit Harry Angstrom, because he was a basketball star in high school, and so he's trying to, live up to that, his best days are behind him, that kind of thing. So I'm going to read from some wife wooing and try to be really do justice to Updike's prose, because this is all about prose. This is about in sentences and paragraphs and prepositions and adjectives and nouns and verbs, syntax, the arrangement of those parts of sentences to represent how we are, how we think, and what it means to be human in the last analysis. So let's jump into wife wooing, and we'll talk about his earlier life because I got some more treats for you. I'm going to get my glasses. I'm going to read the first part of wife wooing. What date is this? I'm trying to see where here we go. Should only have the dates here. Wife wooing. This is the Library of America, the company Richard Poirier started. So this is from the, either late 50s, early 60s, and this is an early short story of Updike. One of the first things I want to see before I finally read this wife wooing excerpt is to say, John Updike is one of those cases of a person with a very, very ambitious, focused goal in his life. And I think even as a child living in Pennsylvania, he was saying, I want to one day write for the New Yorker. It wasn't one day I want to be a writer. It wasn't one day I want to be a sports reporter or what. Often males in his generation was often be a sports writer. Or I'm just using examples. If he couldn't be a cartoonist for Walt Disney, he said, I want to, and that specific, it had to be the New Yorker. And what happens? Updike became one of the top writers at the New Yorker in the 50s. He wrote for a column called Talk of the Town between 1957 and 1958. All of this is long before the Rabbit novels, before he became a celebrated writer. He's actually doing reporting in New York City and doing illustrations as well. There's illustrations in the New Yorker that are his. So just to give you a peek about what that looks like, this is not Alas from 1958, but it is from 1974. And this is the old Talk of the Town logo. And that's it. Talk of the Town. And there's a first thing you say, note and comment. He wrote for the notes and comments. He had to report on local goings on. And then there's a little article on a new singer named Randy Newman here. Randy Newman, a new up-and-coming composer, etc. That's 74. New Yorker. So let me get ready. Let's do wife wooing. Let's do some wife wooing. Let's do again, lyrical, romantic, but also brutally honest, frank prose. All of those together. Unsentimental at times. Challenging. So here we go. I'll try to do my best. This is wife wooing. Oh, my love. Yes. Here we sit on warm, broad floorboards before a fire. The children between us in a crescent eating. The girl and I share 1/2 pint of French fried potatoes. You and the boys share another. And in the center, sharing nothing, making simple reflections within himself like a jewel. The baby, mounted in an easy baby, sucks at his bottle with frowning mastery. His selfish, contemplative eyes, stealing glitter from the center of the flames. And you allow your skirt, the same black skirt in which this morning you, with woman's soft bravery, mounted a bicycle, and sallied forth to play hymns in difficult keys on the Sunday school's old piano. You allow this black skirt to slide off your raised knees down your thighs, slide up your thighs in your body's absolute geography. So the parallel whiteness of their undersides is exposed to the fire's warmth and to my sight. Oh, there is a line of Joyce. I try to recover it from the legendary, imperfectly explored grottos of Ulysses, a garter snapped to please Blazes Boylan in the deep Dublin den. What? Smack warm. That was the crucial word. Smacked smack warm on her smackable warm woman's thigh. Something like that. A splendid man to feel that. So I'm going to reread that little alliterative. Smacked smack warm on her smackable warm woman's thigh. That's a really good introduction to Updike, because among his themes is sexuality and changing sexual mores in the U.S., and we'll come back to that. But it's for a while there, do you get the sense that you're not quite sure what is going on? I mean, that they're saying on the bed, but he's trying to carry as far as possible. What I would say is he's trying to break free from the reductive account of what is happening. In other words, we're on a bed, the kids are here, this baby. What can we do with that? I'm aroused by my wife. I'm remembering my wife, looking at my wife's body when she's riding this bicycle. I'm a husband. This is my inner thoughts. What do we do with this? And so he goes very far, as you can see. He even makes this wordplay of smackworm and it references James Joyce's Ulysses. So this short story depends on you having read Ulysses a little bit, I think, and knowing Dublin and knowing that history, knowing, Joyce's sexuality, and as well as Updike's, of course. So that's a pretty good wife wooing, good, I think, introduction to his little bit of his prose. His prose starts to develop, though, after this story. He starts to experiment in the present tense, writing with the present tense. And he's, again, totally, there are almost no authors who do this. He almost cornered the market on the present tense. So I'm gonna introduce the books now. So, do I have all the books here? I hope so. This is Rabbit Run. We've been talking a lot about Mary McCarthy because of Hannah Arendt, and as you can see, her review says, the reviewers seem to be under the impression that the hero was a terrible character. It's incredible. No, I think it's the most interesting American novel I've read in quite a long time. That's Mary McCarthy for the Paris Review. Today's audiences and readers, especially younger ones, really do think this Harry Angstrom is unworthy of consideration and is a terrible character. And it's one of the reasons I chose these books, I think, somewhat. I mean, not to be too on the nose about it. After all art is attempting to understand the unlikable and the incomprehensible and the unapproachable as much as the instantly relatable and the likable. That's the empathic aspect of all art, not the least literary art and prose, as we're discussing. So that's Rabbit Run. Rabbit Redux. 2. My favorite novel is Rabbit is Rich because it's about the 70s. Rabbit is Rich. It gets interesting. Rabbit at Rest, we're in the 90s. And even this, a novella, Rabbit Remembered, from 2004, around the time Updike wrote Terrorist, which I think was a rather good examination of September 11th and related concerns. It got all bad reviews, but I like Terrorist. But that was the period when he wrote that. So what do these novels have in common, aside from this town in Pennsylvania that he invents and Rabbit and his family? Getting back to the theme of America or sociology of America, every novel he planned to write every 10 years. So he wanted the novels to be a summing up of the previous decade. So Rabbit Run comes out in 1961, and it's about the 50s. It's not everybody's 50s. It may certainly not be your 50s, if you even around in the 50s to have a 50s, because it's idiosyncratic, but he tries to capture aspects of the era. Rabbit Redux is about the 60s, and it's the 60s novel as you're ever going to read. Robert Stone and company had got nothing on Updike when it captures the atonement of that era. The revolutions, cultural and spiritual and metaphysical and otherwise of that era. Rabbit is Rich comes out in 81. It's about the 70s, and so on. And Rabbit at Rest is a really an 80s book. It comes out in 91, and towards the end of Updike's life. So it's every 10 years, and he's capturing aspects of public exterior life. So you have the interior life of this husband and wife wooing, for example. But you have all these exterior things, the pop songs of the day, how people were dressed, the sociological, journalistic details, which Updike never shies away from exculpating and expressing and exhibiting, if I could put it that way. Where are we here? So I'm either going to show Updike talking in this era, black and white, or read from Rabbit Run. I think we're going to start with Rabbit Run. Rabbit, again, as I said, is an ex-basketball star who's, in this novel, Rabbit Run, he's an anti-hero protagonist. He's an anti-hero, and he's rebelling against the strictures and the conformity of the 50s. This is a common theme, especially in prose by male authors at that time and since, of depicting, I don't want to say necessarily men behaving badly, but behaving without consideration for how they were raised, and not consideration for others' feelings often, and trying to find themselves. This is the frankly existentialist aspect of Updike. Updike is was a Christian. And so there's a lot of influence of Karl Barth on his work, actually. And the very first quote, before we enter the novel, is this from Pascal. The motions of grace, grace is capitalized, the motions of grace, the hardness of the heart, external circumstances. That's what the Penze 507. I highly recommend Pascal if you have not read him. This is 1960. We're just going to read the first paragraph. Back to reading. The present tense. Here's Updike's present tense. Boys are playing basketball around a telephone pole with a backboard bolted to it. I'm going to reread that sentence. This is so amazing. Boys are playing basketball around a telephone pole with a backboard bolted to it. Legs, shouts. The scrape and snap of Keds. Keds. That was a popular athletic shoe of that era. Keds basketball shoes. Just sorry to interrupt. We have footnotes here. The scrape and snap of Keds on loose alley pebbles seemed to catapult their voices high into the moist March air blue above the wires. Rabbit Engstrom, coming up the alley in a business suit, stops and watches, though he's 26 and 6'3". So tall, he seems an unlikely rabbit. But the breadth of white face, the pallor of his blue irises, and a nervous flutter under his brief nose as he stabs a cigarette into his mouth partially explain the nickname, which was given to him when he too was a boy. He stands there thinking, the kids keep coming, they keep crowding you up. His standing there makes the real boys feel strange. Eyeballs slide. They're doing this for themselves, not as a show for some adult walking around town in a double-breasted cocoa suit. It seems funny to them, an adult walking up the alley at all. Where's his car? The cigarette makes it more sinister still. Is this one of those going to offer them cigarettes or money to go out in the back of the ice plant with him? They've heard of such things, but are not too frightened. There are 6 of them and 1 of him. So this is a long scene here. The ball leaps over the heads of the 6 lads. So it's he catches. Kids are playing. Rabbit senses. So all 4 of these novels, 5 of these novels, it's Janice feels. Rabbit senses. Rabbit thinks to himself. Rabbit, this is the syntax. It's a verb. These are verb phrases, not noun phrases. This is in keeping with one of the classical pieces of advice that students of writing get, to not overdo noun phrases and instead use verbs, and have your sentences create action and movement and momentum, much like the action of a basketball game by these kids. You know? So it's in 1959, and he's in this place in Pennsylvania, and there's his wife Janet, of course, and there's also going to be a son named Nelson, and you actually see Nelson grow up in these novels over time. I'm just trying to find a good there's a scene where he looks at his old coach. You know, he's hanging out with his old coach. So Rabbit literally does run away in this novel. He abandons his wife Janice in this novel and runs away. Trying to, quote unquote, find himself would be the phrase from 20 years later. So it's a kind of a crisis in his 20s. And then there's other characters. There's a woman named Ruth who he had an affair with. And Ruth is an interesting character. She's a part-time sex worker, although because this book is written in the 50s, it doesn't spell out that it's an implication more than a outright, report of one of her jobs. And then there's the coach, Tethero, and then there's a minister named Eccles. Now, Eccles is an interesting character. Eccles knows Rabbit is in trouble and tries to help out Eccles. And I'm going to try to find thing here. So here's a passage that gets into the heart of Updike's merging of external sociology and internal spirit or internal consciousness. And so tries to have it both. And so he's capturing the pop culture of the era. And he's going to see his old minister, Eccles, Reverend Eccles. Tuesday afternoon, overcast, he takes a bus to Mountain Judge. Eccles' address is at the north end of town. He rides past his own neighborhood in safety, gets off at Spruce, and walks along singing in a high voice to himself the phrase, "Oh, I'm just wild about Harry." Somebody sang that to him. Not the beginning of the song, but the place at the end where the girl repeating goes way up on I'm. He feels on even keel. For 2 days, he and Ruth have lived on his money, and he still has $14 left. Furthermore, he has discovered, poking around her bureau this morning while she was out shopping, that she has this enormous bank checking account with over $500 in it. $500 in 1959 money, I'm just saying. $500 in it at the end of February. They have gone bowling once and have seen 4 movies. Here are the movies. Gigi, Bell, Book, and Candle, The Inn of the Sixth Happiness, and The Shaggy Dog. He saw so many snippets from The Shaggy Dog on the Mickey Mouse Club on television that he was curious to see the whole thing. It was like looking through a photograph album with about half of familiar faces. The scene where the rocket goes through the roof and Fred McMurray runs out with a coffee pot he knew as well as his own face. Ruth was funny. Her bowling was awful. She just sort of paddled up to the line and dropped the ball. Plock! Every time in Gigi, the stereophonic sound loudspeaker behind them in the theater would blare out, she turned around and said, shh, as if it were somebody in the theater talking too loud. Every time Ingrid Bergman's face in The Inn of the Sixth Happiness appeared on the screen, she leaned over to Rabbit and asked him in a whisper, is she really a whore? He was upset by Robert Donat. He looked awful. He knew he was dying. Imagine knowing you're dying and going ahead pretending you're a Mandarin. Ruth's comment about Bell Book and Candle last night was, why don't you ever see any bongo drums around here? He vowed secretly to get some. A half hour ago, waiting for the bus on Weiser Street, he priced a set in the window at the Chords and Records music store, $19.95. All the way out on the bus, he beat bongo patterns on his knees. I'm just wild about Harry. So it's a scene of him hanging out with Ruth. That's what that is. Let's see here. Try to find some Eccles stuff here. I don't know. So Eccles is asleep, and they have to get Eccles up when he goes to visit his old Reverend. We get into some dialogue. So we've dealt with description, but Updike's dialogue is really remarkable, and it's just again, it captures both the individual psychologies of these individual characters with all their idiosyncrasy, but also how they are in part formed by the eras in which they find themselves, whether it's the 50s or the 60s or the 70s. So, let's see here. Mrs. Eccles turns her head, that's the wife, I guess, with an inviting twist. Harry? Angstrom. What do you do, Mr. Angstrom? Well, I'm kind of out of work. Angstrom, of course, aren't you the one who disappeared? The Springer's son-in-law? Right, he replies smartly, and in the mindless follow-through a kind of flower of coordination. She, having on the drop of his answer turned it with prim dismissal away from him, again slaps her sassy ass. Not hard, a cupping hit. Rebuke and fond pat both, well placed on the pocket. She swiftly pivots, swinging her backside to safety behind her. Her freckles dart sharp as pinpricks from her shocked face. Her leaping blood bleaches her skin, and her rigidly cold stare is so incongruous with the lazy, condescending warmth he feels towards her that he pushes his upper lip over his lower in a burlesque expression of penitence. A chaotic tumble on the stairs shakes the wall. Eccles jolts to a stop in front of them, off balance, tucking a dirty white shirt into rumpled suntans. I'm sorry, he says. I hadn't really forgotten. It's kind of cloudy anyway, Rabbit says and smiles involuntarily. Her backside had felt so good. Just right. Dense yet springy. Kind of smack back. This is like the short story, Wife Wooing. See this kind of... He supposes she'll tell, which will finish him here. Just as well. He doesn't know why he's here anyway. Maybe she would have told, but her husband starts annoying her immediately. Oh, I'm sure we can get in 9 before it rains, he tells Rabbit. They're getting ready to play golf. This is all about the golf, and we're supposed to meet for golf. The people in these novels, they play golf and bowl and things like that, and they go to church, and they commit infidelity and have affairs with old girlfriends named Ruth, and they get together and talk about Watergate, later on Watergate and Nixon and the Vietnam, or movies like Bell Book and Candle with Kim Novak and Ingrid Bergman playing a sex worker in a movie. So that's the kind of the thing. All right. Jack, you aren't really going to play golf again. You said you had all these calls to make this afternoon. It's the wife who's behind. Smacked, right? I made calls this morning. You made 2 on Freddie Davis and Mrs. Landis. The same old safe ones. What about the fairies? You've been talking about the fairies now for 6 months. What's so sacred about the fairies? They never do anything for the church. She came on Christmas Sunday and went out by the choir door so she wouldn't have to speak to me. Of course they don't do anything for the church, and that's why you should call, as you know perfectly well. I don't think anything's sacred about the fairies except that you've been brooding about her going out the side door and making everybody's life miserable for months. Now, if she comes on Easter, it'll be the same thing. To tell you my honest opinion, you and Mrs. Furry would hit it off splendidly. You're both equally childish. Lucy, just because Mr. Furry owns a shoe factory doesn't make them more important Christians than somebody who works in a shoe factory. Oh, Jack, you're so tiresome. You're just afraid of being snubbed. And don't quote scripture to justify yourself. I don't care if the fairies come to church or stay away or even become Jehovah's Witnesses. At least the Jehovah's Witnesses put into practice what they say they believe. When Eccles turns to Harry to guffaw conspiratorially after this dig, bitterness cripples his laugh, turns his lips in tightly, so his small-jawed head shows his teeth like a skull. Now, most authors in a passage like that, if a person responded to somebody, the author would not describe his small-jawed head and showing teeth. So it's not somebody talking to somebody. It becomes this other... Updike does is he tries to go as far as possible with description in this sense. So... that's an example of that. And the wife comes back with this. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, Lucy says, but when you asked me to marry you, I told you what I felt and you said, all right, fine. I said as long as your heart remained open for grace. Grace is italicized. Let's see. Where's the, yeah, no. Backwards, yeah, great. Grace. I should say that the linotype's really important in his novels. So these are physical copies, and there was always this thing at the end of the book, a note on type. The text of this book was set on the linotype in January. Jensen made direct type. I don't know. I read it. Leipzig. Yeah, it's from the Dutch and the Leipzig and this kind of stuff. And this is what we use in all of his novels. It's the same linotype. If you go to the 90s, you see the same, more or less the same. This is the aesthetic details of how the books are published and how they're come out into the world. I also have this. This is his memoir. Self-consciousness. This is, of course, him signing one of his books in the 80s, I think. Yeah, I would say early to middle 80s, 1980s. And I think you could see an overview. Yes, it's his family in Pennsylvania. That's the Updike family. He had a big family. He himself had many, many children. I have some videos I'm going to play in the fullness of time where his children speak about what he was like. He suffered from psoriasis his whole life, as did my father, Aubrey Hampton. And one of the reasons, I think, that I even knew about Updike, I think, as my dad said, I like this John Updike. He and I have something in common. But he never said what that was. But he wrote a piece about his own skin suffering from psoriasis. Interesting details about the author. Let me get out the TV and let's look at the man himself in the era of Rabbit Run. Take a break from the prose.
trough of dust underneath each swing.
I'm aware I didn't finish that scene of the minister and Rabbit. They were going to play golf, and I just cut it, so I apologize for that. But okay. But because it's an Updike novel, they're going to argue about God and theology and what grace means and his characters. All right. Because they're males, they're going to talk about female body parts as they talk, and it's going to be quite graphic. That still shocks many readers of Updike novels. Still a thing. All right, so let's see what we got here. I think this is
The blurred path worn across a wedge of grass, the anonymous little mound or embankment polished by play and strewn with pebbles, like the confetti aftermath of a wedding. Such unconsciously humanized intervals of clay, too humble and common even to have a name, remind me of my childhood, when one communes with dirt down among the legs, as it were, of presiding fatherly presences. The earth is our playmate then, and the call to supper has a piercingly sweet, eschatological ring.
So, I'm going to read from the Copyright Act and interrupt this. Section 107, Copyright Act of 1976, allows the unlicensed use of copyrighted materials for purposes such as commentary, using parts of a news article, scientific paper, and for educational purposes, which is what we are doing this very moment. So this is him with his family, and it kind of relates to wife wooing a little bit. That is autobiographical, and you see his little kid there, and he just talks, he's talking in the early 60s about his, you see John Updike here.
Without life, you have nothing, and I don't think that the biochemistry of fiction quite permits us to create life out of components. Rather, it's a more religious thing of listening for voices and letting something take over a little bit. This may seem strange coming from me because I fear that my prose gives the impression of having been rather thoroughly considered. But what of it lives for me has somehow happened sort of all in a rush and all at once, out of whatever stew is brewing it. I thought, having so many children, that I should be in some way writing for them. I can't escape the impression that of the many books they have, my own are among the ones that bore them most. It may well be that I don't have the knack. Having children doesn't make you an expert on them, and I sort of have had to draw on my memories of childhood.
Do you consider that the domestic scene is a particular area for your writing?
I think more happens in the home than is generally known, and since the American culture, for better or worse, seems to be increasingly home-centered, it certainly is an area to be explored. I think that something quite intricate and fierce occurs in homes, and it's worthwhile to try to trace some of the interlockings, the mutual damages, and the metamorphoses that people in conjunction bring about with each other. But I like to write stories out of the home too. I think one trouble with most of with a lot of American fiction, perhaps including mine, is that it all tends to take place indoors. Reading Letting Go by Philip Roth, it's terribly indoors kind of book.
So that's him talking about his own work and his family life and different. It's really nothing quite like seeing this. And again, you see from the bottom here, I've made up this playlist of all Updike in different eras, so I'm prepared for this series. I'm trying to find, does he talk about Rabbit Engstrom's character? I think he does. Hold on. I think so. I don't know.
Treated sympathetically or satirically, and I don't really know. I'm fascinated by the figures of ministers because here you have a man who's being paid and who's investing his entire life and doing something that would seem to doing something quite invisible in a way. The few ministers I've known, I think they exist on the frontier of real problems, of real issues. I'm not entirely convinced, or rather I sometimes wonder if fiction itself, at least as we understand it, as it's evolved since 1730.
1730, he's talking about the origin of the novel.
Isn't rather intimately wed to the Christian faith, and if the Christian faith vanishes, if indeed fiction as we understand it won't vanish also, that is, aren't the novels, and indeed even the movies, the 20th century movies, in some way, they inculcate the idea that there is a justice, that things balance out, that there are evil deeds, and in short, a whole set of notions that may be dispensable, that may be erroneous, but to those of us in the trade, something in the very grain of fiction as we understand it, I think, compels us to consider the kind of problems that ministers must deal with, even if we don't do it from a ministerial angle exactly. So that I don't feel religion is pasted on or shoehorned into my books. It fights its way in, and I really, if anything, try to keep it.
So we're going to go back to some religious material. We'll go back to this passage. Where were we here? Have I lost it? Do I have it? Oh boy, I have. Well, want to go back to Reverend Eccles and Harry Rabbit? Oh. So he's writing about the 50s, and he's writing radically explicit for the time accounts of the intersexual fantasies life of these people, this man. And even with a woman not his wife, it's Ruth, not Janice. Although there's a lot of description of Janice, particularly towards the end of the novel. I don't know. We'll just get some in medias res. Let's jump in here. Good grief. Eccles, the Reverend is speaking here. He says, Eccles doesn't laugh as he had hoped. He seems to dismiss the remark as impudence, a little over the line. It's about some argument or something with the wife, but it was the truth. This is a quote. It's the truth. It just felt like the whole business was fetching and hauling, all the time trying to hold this mess together. She was making all the time. I don't know. It seemed like I was glued in with about a lot of busted toys and empty glasses and television going and meals late and no way of getting out. Then all of a sudden it hit me how easy it was to get out. Just walk out on by damn, it was easy. For less than 2 days it's been. Oh, there's the law, I suppose. I wasn't thinking that much. Your mother-in-law thought of it immediately, but your wife and Mr. Springer are dead against it. I imagine for different reasons. Your wife seems almost paralyzed. She doesn't want anyone to do anything. Poor kid, she's such a mutt. Why are you here? 'Cause you caught me. I mean, why were you in front of your home? I came to get clean clothes. Do clean clothes mean so much to you? Why cling to that decency if trampling on the others is so easy? So it's this rabbit is doing these things. He's wandering off. He's leaving. We come to a thing here. So Reverend Eccles asks him a very occupational question. He says, "Do you believe in God?" to Rabbit. And having rehearsed that this morning, Rabbit answers without hesitation, "Yes." Eccles blinks in surprise. The fury lit in his one-eyed profile shudders, but his face does not turn. "Do you think then God wants you to make your wife suffer?" Let me ask you, do you think God wants a waterfall to be a tree? This question of Jimmy sounds, Rabbit realizes, ridiculous. He is annoyed that Eccles simply takes it in with a sad drag of smoke. There's that Updike, the question sounds, he realizes. This power of the present tense. He realizes that no matter what he says, Eccles will take it with the same weary smoke. He is a listener by trade, because he's a reverend listener. His big, fair head seems stuffed with the gray mash of everybody's precious secrets and passionate questions. I'm going to reread that. Bear with me. Indulge me. His big, fair head seems stuffed with the gray mash of everybody's precious secrets and passionate questions. A mash that nothing, young as he is, can color. For the first time, Rabbit dislikes him. "No," Eccles says after a thought, "but I think he wants a little tree to become a big tree." So they're arguing about him leaving his wife. Why do you make your life suffer, Jens? Why do you leave your wife? Why you? This is a theme throughout the novels, because of course, in Rabbit Redux, the novel after this, to be a spoiler, Janice leaves him in the 60s and shacks up with a Greek restaurateur, Stavros, and then he in turn forms a commune with Skeeter and Jill, this 19-year-old girl, and his son Nelson. So there's all these comings and goings. And at this time, he wrote the novel Couples, about partner sharing, if I could put it in an anodyne sense. I won't use the term swapping, but partner sharing in 60s suburbs couples, and made the cover of Time magazine, Updike did in that era, about his candor in discussing sexual matters and fidelity, infidelity. And then Rabbit, basically says to the minister, "I'm not going back to that little fatal dope, no matter how sorry you feel for her. I don't feel what she feels. I haven't known for years. All I know is what's inside me. That's all I have. Do you know what I was going to support that bunch? I was demonstrating a penny's worth of tin called a frigging mega peeler in 5 and dime stores." So again, it's that cry, "I'm not going back to her. I'm not." You've seen this 1,000 times. You've seen this. This is actually quite similar to a now disliked movie that was the hit of the Y2K, American Beauty. Right? Kevin Spacey character. Similar territory. This is a suburban, in this case, more working class suburbs, not at all affluent. And Rabbit is rich, of course. Rabbit rises in income and status, and he runs the car dealership of his wife's dad, Toyota. "You got it, Toyota. Got a deal for you." All this kind of stuff. Salesman. But he has these odd jobs before that. So the big event at the end of this novel, and I'm going to say it right out now and not wait if you haven't read it, is that his wife kills their son, their newborn baby. accidentally in a bathtub in an alcohol stupor. So she's drunk and she accidentally drowns their baby, and that's what closes out. So this is a 1-2 punch. You know, the main character, the hero, runs from his wife. His wife kills their baby. His wife is drunk, drinking alcohol. He's having these conversations with Reverend Eccles about the nature of faith. And this is the first novel, right swinging out of the gate. In 50s America, this is what John Updike presents to the public. It would be hard for me to overestimate how volcanic such material would have been in those years. Probably as much so now. I don't know. But that's Harry Angstrom, the down in his luck. He had all this, again, it's like Updike describes as a character that had all those glories in high school. He was a great high school star. And now what's he going to do? His athlete jock days are behind him. And this is what happens. And that is Rabbit Run. That's the world of the Rabbit books. The other reason I picked these novels is that I wanted to get, again, in the spirit of empathy, in the spirit of art, representation, to enter into, try to understand people unlike ourselves, or maybe like ourselves, I don't know. So what is the mindset? What would have been the lives, biographies, mindsets of people who now have, I'm going to put this in this way, have unfortunate effect on all of our lives. Who were such people 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago? Who would they have been? How do we get here? How did America get here, actually? John Updike was a lifelong Democrat, but he was a conservative Democrat. So his notorious essay, Why I'm Not a Dove, it's actually I think it's in Self-Consciousness, where he defends, through anti-communism, disagrees with Eugene McCarthy and supports Hubert Humphrey in the war effort. And of course, the character Rabbit is sort of a little bit of a Nixon Democrat, I think. If that's the word, just like you had years later Reagan Democrats. But John Updike, the man, was always steadfastly Democratic, capitalized D, as in the party, as well as lowercase liberal Democratic in his outlook. His love for the poor and the underrepresented, and that comes out in these novels. His ability to describe Janice, the long-suffering wife, if that's, at least in these novels, which he is quite something. And so out of the gate, if you have one of your main characters accidentally drowning their baby, and we're going to have 5 books of Janice going through all these different changes over the course of this series. I don't know. I want to go back because I think there's some moment here.
But I don't feel religion is pasted on or
Yeah, we saw
my last novel, a rather short one called Of the Farm, was conceived of as a kind of a kind of a trade between the mother and son, whereby the
Bentley's best, brags, drama books. No, let's go. This is writing which a certain laziness, a certain loss of vision has taken place. That is, you cease to see.
Okay, he's
Herbert
very.
Mead, Pancha Tantra, Hampson's Pan, Tillich, Ill, Khalil Gibran, and Henry James sell better if
19
their
cents.
spines are not
So he.
austerely stiff.
He's asked what makes a book bad or good? What makes a writer bad or good? And he's quite direct in his answer.
How would you define good writing?
I see good writing really in moral terms.
In moral terms.
Of honesty.
Honesty.
There are many ways to write well, and only one way to write badly, and the way to write badly really is to be dishonest, and it's amazing to me that there is so much bad writing, because it really is a little harder to do than to write well, I think.
So he says it's harder to write badly than well because you have to take this extra step of being dishonest. Now that's interesting. So he's implying that honesty is this natural impulse. Now honesty upsets people. I mean, these characters, Harry Angstrom is honest about his wife and his attitude towards her, running from her and all this, and he's honest about these men getting together. He's honest about your main character smacking your reverend's wife on the behind, playfully, and not only doing it, but also he goes on and on about how much he enjoyed it, and this is brutal honesty, which is a hallmark, I think, of art from this period. Later on in the 90s and 2000s, female authors jump into this terrain. Female authors jump into this terrain of this kind of honesty. Of course, Ann Beattie and Ann Tyler come to mind as examples of this. Of course, what's a recent example? Chris Kaus, I Love Dick, if you know that work, is an example of that. There's so many, really. I mean, I happen to like Ann Tyler and Ann Beattie. This kind of not naturalistic, realistic candor, honesty comes to the fore. And you can see here him smiling. It's the early 60s. I'm going to pause it there and talk about what's upcoming in this series. So in this series, we're going to get into what I call narrative details. So what happens in the world of this novel? Who are the characters? Because in this episode, I have not presented all that. Just the immediate family of Janice's wife, Harry, some of these, the Reverend, some of these characters, Ruth. But there's also his mom, Mim, M-I-M. His dad. And so we're gonna get into what I call narrative details, but also we're gonna open up some of these later novels. And we're going to do it partly in a chronological fashion, but also partly in a nonlinear fashion. And pick, so for example, jump ahead here to the book after this, Rabbit Redux. In the second novel, we are in 1970. Novels about the 60s. So just to give you a sense of John Updike loves to delve into excerpts of popular culture, especially what people are watching on television. And Rabbit Redux in 1969, I think, is the actual year of this. There's a long passage. This is something on the Carol Burnett show that they're watching. You remember Carol? In this skit, the Lone Ranger has a wife. She stamps around a cabin saying how she hates housework, hates her lonely life. You're never home, she says. You keep disappearing in a cloud of dust with a hearty, hi-yo silver. The unseen audience laughs. Rabbit laughs. That present tense laughs. Nelson, that's Rabbit's son, it's a boy in this book, doesn't see what's so funny. Rabbit tells him, that's how they always used to introduce the program. The kid says crossly, I know, Dad, and Rabbit loses the thread of the skit a little. There has been a joke he didn't hear, whose laughter is dying. Now the Lone Ranger's wife is complaining that Daniel Boone brings his wife beautiful furs, but what do I ever get from you, a silver bullet? Who needs a silver bullet, right? She opens the door and a bushel of silver bullets comes crashing down and floods the floor. For the rest of the skit, Carol Burnett and Gomer Pyle and that man who plays Tonto, not Sammy Davis Jr., but another TV person, keep slipping and crunching on these bullets by accident. Rabbit thinks of the millions who are watching, the millions the sponsors are paying, and still nobody took time to realize that this would happen. A mess of silver bullets on the floor. Tonto tells the Lone Ranger, better luck next time, put 'em bullet and gun first. The wife turns to complaining about Tonto. Him. Why must we always keep having him to dinner? He never has us back. Tonto tells her that if she comes to his teepee, she would be kidnapped by 7 or 8 braves. Instead of being frightened, she is interested. She rolls those big Carol Burnett eyes and says, let's go, Kemosabe. Nelson asks, Dad, what's Kemosabe? So there's all this déclassé is a word, anachronistic, racist even, pop detritus of this era. The Lone Ranger, and Tonto, and it's a Carol Burnett's parody of those things. So reading this book is like history lesson of American popular culture. You have to know what the Lone Ranger was. You have to know who Tonto was. You have to know who Carol Burnett was. And Harvey Korman and Tim Conway. He's taking all the time, and also this guy watching this with his little kid, Nelson. Nelson's trying to make sense of all this. I can't resist getting into some 60s politics. All right, where are we here? Now, Nelson's been hanging out with kids in the neighborhood. Rabbit's son. Is he about 13 now? I would say he's 13 in this book. Somewhere in there, 12, 13, maybe. Nelson's talking about what... No, this is a 12-year-old, okay. Nelson says, Billy Fonksat says when we grow up, we're going to overthrow the system. Springer can't hear, lost in his vision of executive madness and corruption. Springer says he tried to turn it upside down for the benefit of the black and white trash. And when that didn't work for 8 years, he finagled the damn Japanese into attacking Pearl Harbor, so he had a war to bail him out of the Depression. That's why you have these wars, believe it or not, to bail the Democrats out of their crazy economics. LBJ now, as soon as he got his 4-year guarantee, went into Vietnam where nobody wanted us, just to get the coloreds up into the economy. LBJ, he was an FDR man. Truman, the same thing in career. History bails me out every time. Call me an old fogey if you want to. What's your angle on it, Nelson? This old man talking to this little kid and spouting the most today conspiratorial, extremist, far right. We don't, we don't change. It's the same crap today as was then. It's the same. Then the boy responds, well, last night on television, the boy says, we watched an old movie about fighting the Japs in the Pacific. This little boat sank and the captain or whatever he was swam miles with a broken back, dragging this other guy. That was Kennedy, Springer says, pure propaganda. They made that movie because old Joe owned a lot of these studios, meaning Joe Kennedy. So he's spouting more theories about how the world works, that they made these movies. They were propaganda to support the Kennedys, and Joe Kennedy owned a movie theater, so that's why they're showing these movies. It even gets worse. He talks about the Jewish communists, and this is, Updike puts these people in this book. And lets them spout their, I should say, untruthful insanity. But it's what they believe, and that's part of the color of these books alongside the Carol Burnett show in '69, the early Carol Burnett show, young Carol Burnett show, and all the rest of it. And so we're going to get into things like that in the 70s and 80s and the 90s in the series, and we're going to see what an artist of Updike stature does with taking what I call the detritus, or the archival junk from the junkyard. Well, sometimes it's not junk. Sometimes it's, in the case of Carol Burnett, it's actually very good. Yes, this Friday, a full episode at 1 p.m. after your Thanksgiving turkey or tofurkey. Britt Whittle will be our guest. I love this episode. He's a very interesting man, actor, studying in the seminary in Princeton, and he talks about his life. And we'll come back next month with Rabbit and John Updike. So, turning that off. Please subscribe to Journey of an Aesthete if you can, and get previews of upcoming shows. And I'm going to take a drink of Think Coffee because we've been thinking a lot today, and use my left hand to drink it. And say goodbye and have a decent Thanksgiving, if possible, even a great or happy Thanksgiving, whatever it is you eat and wherever it is you will be. Thank you.